The year was 1892. The wind was the only thing that prospered. It scoured the high desert plateau, that vast, dry tableland caught between the last edge of Utah and the beginning of Wyoming. The sky was a pale, bleached silver, exhausted from the relentless sun. In the long afternoons, the mountains to the west did not glow. They bruised, turning a deep, hopeless purple just before the darkness swallowed them. Down in the basin, the creek that fed the small Callahan ranch was a whisper of its former self. The drought had pressed a heavy thumb on the land for 2 long seasons, and the water had surrendered. What was once a lively current was now just a chain of muddy potholes, simmering in the heat, connected only by the memory of flow. Ruth Callahan stood on the porch of the house. She was 58 years old, and she felt as weathered as the land. She had not so much built this house as she had maintained it, fighting back the constant siege of dust, wind, and decay while her husband dreamed. Her hands rested on the warped porch rail. They were a map of her life. The skin was thick, cross-hatched with the silver scars of barbed wire and the puckered white marks of stove burns. Her fingertips were like hard leather, permanently dotted with the tiny, dense calluses from 40 years of driving a needle through canvas and wool. She was, by necessity and then by habit, a frugal woman. She saved scraps of string. She patched the patches on Ephraim's work clothes. She wasted nothing, least of all time or emotion. The people in the nearby town of Junction Creek saw her as stern, a woman whose mouth was set in a permanent line of propriety. They were not wrong, but they missed the thing she guarded, the quiet warmth that still lived deep in her eyes. It was a bed of banked coals, having seen too much to burn recklessly, but not yet extinguished. Those coals had been nearly smothered 6 weeks ago. Ephraim Callahan was gone. After 40 years, he had left 40 years of shared beds in the bitter cold, of meals stretched thin during hard winters, of silent companionship. He had packed a single valise, hitched their second-best mule to a borrowed cart, and disappeared. He had followed a traveling singer, a woman half his age. Ruth heard, a woman who wore rouge in the bright light of day, and whose voice sounded like a rusty hinge. He did not leave a proper goodbye. He left a note on the kitchen table, weighted down by the sugar bowl. The note spoke of a new life. It spoke of feeling young again, of passions he thought were dead. It didn't speak of the 40 years Ruth had poured into this ranch, into him. It didn't mention the way she had stitched his shirts until the collars were more thread than fabric, or the times she had helped bale hay when his back gave out. He wrote of his stifled dreams. He didn't write of the life she had stifled to make room for his. The singer was the insult. The injury arrived a week later, delivered by the post rider. Ephraim had not just left her. He had erased her. He had left behind a staggering weight of debt, all of it secured against her name and her property. It was all done in secret, at the county seat, papers filed and signed with his elegant, selfish signature. He had mortgaged the house and the land, everything, the roof over her head, the ground beneath her feet, the very stitches that held her world together, all of it gambled away for a song. The news moved through Junction Creek the way alkali dust moves. It was fine. It was invasive, and it left the taste of ash in everyone's mouth. Ruth went to church that first Sunday after. She always went to church. She wore her best gray poplin, the collar starched and stiff. She would not hide. She would not give them the satisfaction of her shame. But the silence that fell when she opened the door was louder than any sermon. It was the pity that cut the deepest. It was the sympathetic, knowing tilt of the head from the women in the Ladies' Aid Society. It was the way Mrs. Gable, the banker's wife, patted her arm with a soft kid glove that cost more than Ruth's whole dress. Then came the whispers. She heard them from behind the bolts of calico at the mercantile. She heard them over the tops of the pews. Poor Ruth, all that work, and for nothing. Heard she was a cold woman. A man needs warmth. Drove him right to it. Imagine, at her age, 58, still trying to cling to a man who wanted sunshine. It is a judgment. I say, pride. She always held her chin too high. They saw her as a fool, a creature to be pitied, or worse. They saw her as a lesson, a woman left behind. Her private grief was stolen from her. It was turned into a public spectacle, a cautionary tale for wives to mind their husbands better. She was no longer Ruth Callahan, proprietor of the finest tailoring this side of Cheyenne. She was the old woman Ephraim had discarded. This was a new kind of conflict, one she could not fight with a sharp needle or a straight seam. Society had passed its verdict, and she was found wanting. The final killing blow did not come from the whispers. It came from a man in a crisp suit who smelled of bay rum and eastern banks. His name was Silas Pike. He was the bank's lawyer. He was a man whose smile never reached his cold eyes, a man whose boots seemed too clean for the ever-present dust of their town. He sat in her parlor, the one she had swept clean that very morning. He placed his fine leather satchel on her grandmother's lace tablecloth, and the sight of it made her stomach clench. Mrs. Callahan. He began. His voice was smooth as oiled wood. We find ourselves in an unfortunate situation. He laid out the full geography of Ephraim's deceit. The mortgage on the house was bad enough, but Ephraim, in his desperate, feverish need for cash, had not just signed away the deed to the land. He had signed away the water rights. Not just her water rights. He had signed away the rights to the shared spring, the one that fed her small herd and the 2 neighboring ranches. It was a tangled, purposefully confusing document, drafted by men like Silas Pike. In essence, it gave the bank control of the source, the very water. Ruth felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her skin cold and tight. Land without water, in this territory, was just a patch of colorless dust. It was worthless. Ephraim would not, she whispered. The words tasted like lies even to her. He knew the water. He could not. Silas Pike did not argue. He didn't need to. He merely pushed the stack of papers across the table. Her husband's flowing, arrogant signature was everywhere. The bank must recover its investment. Madam, Mr. Callahan has defaulted on the loan. He cleared his throat, a small, polite, obnoxious sound. You have 30 days to satisfy the full amount of the debt. Otherwise, the bank will take possession of the land, the house, and the water. 30 days. He tipped his immaculate hat, retrieved his satchel, and left. He left the papers on her table. He left the scent of bay rum hanging in the air like a shroud. For one night, Ruth Callahan sat in the dark. She did not light a lamp. She didn't weep. Weeping was a luxury, a waste of salt and water, and she was, as always, a frugal woman. She sat in her ladder-back chair, her calloused hands gripping the armrests. She sat perfectly still and let the full, crushing weight of the ruin settle onto her. When the first pale silver light of dawn touched the window pane, she stood up. The time for grieving was over. She did not go to the bank to plead. She did not appeal to the pity of the church. She was a practical woman. She went to her small sewing shop, the room attached to the mercantile, and she took down the small, neat sign that read, R. Callahan, Seamstress. She sold her bolts of cloth, her wools and cottons, to the mercantile owner for pennies on the dollar. She sold her heavy shears, her tracing wheels, and the beautiful, black iron sewing machine she had ordered from the Sears Roebuck catalog. She packed one large, battered trunk. Into it went her needles, her bone buttons, and spools of thread in every color. She packed her awls and her leather punch. These were the tools of her trade, her true livelihood. She packed the 2 heavy quilts she had made herself, one a Lone Star pattern, one a log cabin. They were her only real wealth, the product of thousands of hours, thousands of perfect, tiny stitches. Finally, she went to her father's old writing desk. From a locked drawer at the bottom, she retrieved a rolled sheet of heavy canvas, yellowed and cracked with age. It was a map, a hand-drawn map her father, an old prospector with restless feet, had made decades ago. It showed the high country, the plateaus to the west, and marked with a tiny, faded X. It showed a place he had called Willow Draw, a place, he always swore, where the water never failed. She sold her few remaining cattle to a neighbor for a pittance, just enough to cover the feed bill she owed. She used the last of her shop money to buy a sturdy, stubborn mule and a small, second-hand freight wagon. The wagon was old, but the wood seemed sound. On the 30th day, the day Silas Pike was due to arrive with the sheriff, she loaded her trunk, a barrel of water, and a sack of flour onto the wagon. She hitched the mule. She did not look back at the house as she drove away. She did not look at the dying creek or the dust-covered porch. She looked west, toward the purple mountains. The trail was not a road. It was a suggestion. 2 faint ruts of paler dust cutting through the endless gray sagebrush. She traveled for 3 days. The silence of the high desert was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic squeak of the wagon wheels and the constant, dry whisper of the wind. On the 4th morning, she came upon a man on the side of the trail. He was fixing a broken cinch, his horse ground-tied nearby, patiently waiting. He was an older man, perhaps a few years beyond her own 58. He was not worn down, he was weathered. His face was a roadmap of sun and wind. His eyes, when he looked up at the sound of her wagon, were the exact color of the pale. Washed-out sky. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy. No motion was wasted. He nodded at her. "Ma'am," he said. The word was quiet, almost rusty. Ruth pulled her mule to a halt. She looked at the saddle. She saw the problem immediately. The thick leather of his saddle rigging, the part that held the cinch strap, had torn through. "That will not hold a rope," she said. It was not a question. The man grunted, still fiddling with the leather. "It will not hold me much longer." Ruth looked at his hands. They were strong, rope-scarred hands, but they were clumsy with the fine work of a needle. She set her brake. "I have an awl," she said. She climbed down from the wagon seat and went to her trunk. She retrieved her heavy leather working kit. For 20 minutes, they worked in a companionable, absolute silence. She used her sharpest awl to punch new holes, her strong, practiced hands driving the steel through the thick hide with steady pressure. She selected a heavy, waxed linen thread and stitched the rigging back together, her movements quick, certain, and economical. He watched her. His gaze was steady. It was not intrusive, but it was curious. He watched her hands, recognizing the skill in them. When she was finished, she bit the thread clean and knotted it with a sharp pull. "That will hold you," she said. He tested the rigging, pulling it with his full weight. The seam was stronger than the original. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. He saw her graying hair pulled back in a tight, sensible bun. He saw the stern set of her mouth and the tired, patient coals in her eyes. "You did not have to stop," he said. "A stopped wagon rests the mule," Ruth replied, packing her awl and needle back into their oilcloth roll. He reached into his jean pocket. "I will not take your money," she said, before he could offer it. Her voice was flat, not unkind, but final. It is a bad day when folks cannot help each other on the trail. He paused, his hand still in his pocket. He seemed unused to conversation, as if the words themselves felt strange in his mouth. "Jonah Hale," he said at last. It was an introduction and a thank you, all in one. "Ruth Callahan," she replied. He nodded again, a short, stiff gesture. He swung up into the mended saddle, settling his weight with a faint groan of leather. "My thanks, Mrs. Callahan. The trail west of here is rough. The wind picks up toward evening. Be watchful." He touched the brim of his dusty hat and rode on, heading west. He did not look back. He seemed to melt into the heat shimmer and the sage. Jonah Hale. He looked like a man who had been planted in the desert and had simply, stubbornly, refused to die. A reclusive rancher, she thought. He certainly looked the part. Jonah Hale had been right about the wind. It began in the late afternoon. Just as the mountains began to turn their bruised purple, the pale silver sky turned a sickly, jaundiced yellow, then a brooding, churning brown. The wind did not rise. It attacked. It came from the west, a solid wall of grit and alkali dust that turned the world blind and gray. Ruth's mule brayed, a high, panicked sound, turning its backside to the gale. The dust was not like normal dust. It was fine as flour, and it got into her eyes, her mouth, her lungs. It stung her exposed skin like 1,000 tiny needles. The old wagon complained, its dry wood groaning under the assault. The wind hammered it, trying to peel the canvas cover back like a loose scab. Ruth pulled her shawl up, covering her nose and mouth, squinting into the gloom. She could not see the trail. She could barely see the tips of the mule's ears. She had to keep moving. She had to find a bluff, a washout, any kind of shelter. Then she heard the sound, a sharp, ugly crack, loud even over the screaming wind. It sounded like a gunshot muffled by a heavy blanket. The wagon lurched violently. Down and to the left, the mule stopped dead, pulling hard against the sudden, immovable drag. Ruth climbed down from the seat, her heart sinking. She was stepping down into the heart of the howling storm. She already knew. She did not need to look. The rear axle, dried out by the same relentless drought that had claimed her ranch, had split clean in two. The left rear wheel was canted at a hopeless, broken angle, the wagon's weight resting on the splintered wood. It was not just broken. It was finished. A cold, clear understanding settled over her, colder than the wind. She was stranded. She was miles from Junction Creek, miles from wherever Jonah Hale had been going, and uncountable, impossible miles from the X on her father's map. She was alone, in the middle of a dust storm, with a broken wagon. She checked her water barrel, still 3/4 full. She had the quilts for warmth. She could, perhaps, unhitch the mule and ride it, but ride where she could not see 10 feet in any direction. The storm could last for an hour, or it could last for 3 days. She felt a flicker of something she had not allowed herself to feel. Not when Ephraim left, not when Silas Pike served his papers, not when the women whispered. She felt fear. It was a sharp, acidic taste in the back of her throat. She leaned against the broken wagon, turning her back to the wind, trying to catch her breath. The dust was so thick it was almost night. And then a shape emerged from the brown haze. It was a horse, walking slowly, head down, a rider, leaning forward against the wind. The rider stopped just yards from her, looming like an apparition. Ruth's hand went to the small boot knife she kept at her waist. The rider pushed back his hat. It was Jonah Hale. He looked at her. He looked at the broken wagon, at the splintered axle. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't ask what happened. He simply accepted the reality of it, the way he accepted the wind. He dismounted and came closer, leading his horse. "Axle is split," he said, his voice loud to be heard over the gale. Ruth nodded, her hand still on her knife. "You cannot stay here," he shouted. "The storm is settling in." "Where am I to go?" she shouted back. "My ranch." "It is not far. Willow Draw." Ruth stared at him. Willow Draw, the name from her father's map. "There is shelter there," he said. "We must leave the wagon." "But my trunk," she protested. "My things." He looked at the trunk, then at her. "We can come back for it when the wind dies. We cannot take it now. You can ride. Your mule will follow." He brought his horse alongside the wagon. He offered her his hand. It was rough, callous like her own. She looked at this stranger, this man of the desert. She looked at the howling, blinding dust. She had no choice. Ruth Callahan, a woman who had never depended on anyone, reached up and took his hand. He pulled her up, setting her behind his saddle. It was a long time since she had been this close to a man. He smelled of dust, leather, and something clean, like cedar. He whistle-eached sharply. Her mule, grateful for the company, fell in behind them. Jonah Hale turned his horse, and together, the two strangers, two survivors, rode into the heart of the storm. They rode toward a place called Willow Draw. The door to a new, uncertain chapter was opening. The wind did not release them. It pursued them, a physical, snarling beast, tearing at their clothes and scouring their faces with sand. Ruth clung to the back of Jonah's saddle, her head bowed, her world reduced to the solid, unyielding shape of the man in front of her and the howling brown darkness. They rode for what felt like an eternity, but it could not have been more than an hour. Then, Abruptly, they were out of the worst of it, riding into the lee of a high, rocky bluff. The roar of the storm softened to a deafening moan. Ahead, nestled into a wide, sheltered basin, was a collection of low, dark buildings. Willow Draw. It was not a grand ranch, it was a place built by hands, not by contract. A small, sturdy cabin of peeled logs chinked with mud, a long, low barn, and a web of corrals made from weathered cedar posts. Everything looked as if it had grown from the ground it stood on, a testament to decades of stubborn solitude. A single, enormous cottonwood tree stood guard over the cabin, its ancient branches thrashing in the wind. Jonah led them into the barn, the sudden stillness inside a shock to the senses. He slid from his horse and turned to help Ruth down. Her legs were stiff, her body numb with cold and tension. For a moment, she had to grip his arm to steady herself. His arm was like a fence post, hard and unmoving. He did not seem to notice, his attention already on the animals, uncinching his saddle and leading her mule into an empty stall with a measure of hay. The cabin was one room. It was meticulously clean, but relentlessly male. A narrow bed was built into one wall, covered with a thick buffalo robe. A heavy table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A massive stone fireplace took up most of the far wall, its hearth swept clean. But it was the kitchen area that drew Ruth's eye. A squat, efficient stove made of dark red brick stood against the wall, a stack of firewood neatly piled beside it. Every pot, every tin plate was hung on a peg. There was a place for everything, and everything in its place. It was the home of a man who had long ago made a truce with loneliness, and the terms of that truce were order. The storm raged for 2 full days. They existed within its roar, isolated from the rest of the world. The silences between them were long, but not uncomfortable. They were the silences of people who understood that words were tools, not decorations, and should be used with purpose. On the 3rd morning, the wind had finally exhausted itself. A weak, watery sunlight filtered through the single grimy window of the cabin. Ruth was awake before Jonah, her internal clock set by a lifetime of early rising. She moved quietly, adding wood to the embers in the stove, and found his coffee pot. It was dented and black with soot. The coffee itself, kept in a tin can, was coarse and dark. She brewed it strong, the way her father had liked it. The rich, bitter aroma filled the small cabin, a smell of civilization in the heart of the wild. Jonah stirred in his bunk, a low groan escaping him as he swung his legs to the floor. He sat there for a moment, rubbing his face, his eyes still clouded with sleep. Ruth poured a cup of the steaming black coffee into a tin mug and set it on the table. He looked at the cup, then at her. He took a slow sip, his eyes closing for a moment. He took another. I have lived on beans and silence for a long time. "Mrs. Callahan?" Ruth said, her voice laced with a dry, quiet humor. She was watching him from the stove. "How long has it been for you?" Jonah Hale set the cup down gently on the table. He looked at her, and the faintest ghost of a smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was a rare, fleeting thing. "Long enough," he replied, his voice a low rumble, long enough to forget how to lie. The moment passed, but it left something behind, a small patch of solid ground in the landscape of their shared uncertainty. Later that day, after Jonah confirmed the wagon was beyond trailside repair, he helped her retrieve her trunk. They loaded it onto her mule and brought it back to the cabin. Opening it felt like an intrusion, like unpacking her entire life onto this stranger's floor. But as she touched her needles, her spools of thread, the familiar weight of her shears in her hand, a sense of herself returned. She was not just a woman abandoned. She was not just a victim of circumstance. She was Ruth Callahan, seamstress. She could make things. She could mend what was broken. As she sorted her belonging, the thoughts she had held at bay during the crisis of the storm came creeping back. The image of Ephraim's note on the table, The memory of Mrs. Gable's pitying smile. 40 years. She had invested 40 years of her life, her youth, her body, her skill, into a partnership that had been treated like a bad investment, liquidated without notice. A deep, cold anger settled in her gut. It was not a hot, shouting anger. It was a patient, methodical fury, the kind that could fuel a person for a very long time. What was a woman worth when her husband, her partner of 4 decades, decided she was worth nothing? The question was a poison, and she had no antidote for it. So she did what she had always done. She set to work. She mended a tear in her own skirt with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She cleaned and oiled her tools. She maintained her own small world, reinforcing its seams against the chaos that threatened to tear it apart. Jonah, too, had his ghosts. On the second evening, Ruth saw him standing by the window, looking out not at the subsiding storm, but at the sturdy fence line of his main corral. His posture was rigid, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He was not just looking at a fence, he was looking at a memory. Later, when the silence felt heavier than usual, he spoke. It was not a conversation. It was a confession offered to the fire. "I had a son," he said, his voice flat. His name was Ethan. He was a good boy, headstrong. He thought the land should be open, free, the way it always was. He paused, and the fire crackled in the quiet. "A new man came, a homesteader, bought the parcel just east of here, put up the new wire, the kind with the barbs. My Ethan said it was an insult to God, an insult to the cattle. He went one night to cut the wire. The homesteader was waiting. He was just a boy, 17. He never even saw the man who ended him. Over a piece of wire." The pain in his voice was old, worn smooth like a river stone, but no less heavy. He had built this solitary life around that empty space. He had walled himself in, his silence a more impenetrable barrier than any barbed wire fence. He was a man consumed by a quiet, enduring guilt, a feeling that if he had just said the right thing, done the right thing, his son would still be alive. The next morning, Ruth noticed the water system. A series of crudely fashioned wooden troughs carried water from a shallow, spring-fed well near the cabin to the horse trough in the corral. It was a clever setup, but one of the sections had warped, and a steady, wasteful trickle of water was spilling onto the dry ground. In a land defined by its thirst, the sight of it was an offense. She found Jonah sharpening an axe by the barn. "That sluice is leaking," she said. "Wasting water?" Jonah did not stop the rhythmic slide of the wet stone against the steel. "It has worked well enough," he said. "We could fix it. A new board. Maybe some pitch from your supply." He stopped then and looked at her. His face was a closed door. "Leave it be," he said. "It is my concern." Ruth said nothing more, but the sight of that wasted water ate at her. It was the same kind of senseless waste that had defined the end of her marriage. That night, she lay awake on the pallet of blankets she had made for herself by the hearth. She was a guest in this man's home, and he had told her to leave it be, but she was also a woman who could not abide a problem she knew how to fix. Before the sun rose, she was outside in the cold. Still air. She found a spare plank in the barn, and using Jonah's saw, she carefully measured and cut a new section for the trough. She found a can of pine pitch, heated it over a small, smokeless fire, and sealed the joints until they were watertight. By the time the first rays of sunlight struck the top of the western bluffs, the water was running clean and true. A quiet, steady stream flowing directly into the horse trough without a single drop being lost. She was back in the cabin, drinking her coffee, when Jonah came in from his morning chores. He did not say anything for a long time. He walked over to the water bucket, filled the dipper, and drank deeply. Finally, he walked to the door and looked out toward the corral. He watched the perfectly flowing water for a full minute. He came back inside and put another log on the fire. He said, his back to her. Good. The word hung in the air, small and heavy, worth more than a whole speech of praise. That evening, A thaw began. As Ruth sat mending one of Jonah's work shirts, its elbows worn paper-thin, she found herself speaking. "A good seam can be the difference between a man freezing and a man making it home," she said quietly, her needle flashing in the firelight. "I once stitched a coat for a trapper. He came back a year later, told me the coat had saved his life in a blizzard up in the Wind Rivers, said the seams held when everything else gave way." Jonah, who had been oiling a piece of harness leather, looked up. He nodded slowly. "Had a calf born 1 year in a late frost," he said, his voice a low counterpoint to her own. "Smallest thing you ever saw. The mother rejected it. I brought it in here, kept it in a box by the fire, fed it milk with my fingers. Everyone said it would die. It lived. It is the grandmother of half my herd now. Stubborn little thing." Ruth looked up from her sewing, and he looked at her. A shared understanding passed between them. They were two people who understood the profound importance of small, stubborn acts of survival. They understood the value of things that hold. A good seam, a determined calf, a quiet life, and, for the first time, in the warm glow of the firelight, the two old, solitary people smiled. A genuine, unburdened smile that reached both of their eyes. And then they laughed, a quiet, rusty sound that was all the more precious for its rarity. The next afternoon, the world intruded. Ruth was shaking a small rug out on the porch when she saw him. A rider, far out, near the eastern edge of Jonah's property. He was not a rancher. His clothes were too new, his hat was too clean. He rode a fine-looking bay horse that seemed out of place in the rugged landscape. He was not just passing through. He had stopped where the small creek, the same one that fed Willow Draw, trickled out from the base of the bluff. He dismounted and seemed to be taking measurements, looking at the flow of the water, then consulting a paper in his hand. Jonah came to stand beside her on the porch. His eyes narrowed, his face hard as granite. "Who is that?" Ruth asked, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. "He is no one I know," Jonah said, but his tone was heavy with suspicion. "That is Pike's foreman, from the big syndicate buying up land to the south. Silas Pike." The name was a foul taste in Ruth's mouth. The man in the fine suit with the cold eyes. The man who had taken her home. The man whose ambition, it seemed, was as vast and as thirsty as the desert itself. The rider made a few more notes, then mounted his horse and rode away. Not toward them, but back the way he had come. He left behind a profound sense of menace. The fragile peace of Willow Draw had been shattered. The forces that had destroyed Ruth's life, the world of lawyers and syndicates, of mortgages and water rights, had found them. She looked at Jonah. The brief warmth of their shared laughter the night before was gone, replaced by the grim reality of this new threat. They stood together on the porch, two strangers who were no longer strangers, watching the empty horizon. A question hung unspoken in the quiet air between them, after a lifetime of building and losing, of loving and grieving. Was there any place left for a person to simply be after 40 years, after a life already spent? Was there any room for something new to begin? Or was the world determined to take that, too? The silence that followed the foreman's departure was heavier and more suffocating than the dust storm had been. Jonah Hale became even more withdrawn, his movements tight with a tension that radiated off him. He spent the day reinforcing the corral fence, his hammer blows ringing sharp and angry in the clear air. Ruth watched him, the knot of dread in her stomach pulling tighter. Silas Pike. The name was a brand, a mark of ruin. He had taken her home. Now, his shadow was falling on the only roof that was left to her. She waited until evening, until they were inside the small cabin, the smell of her rabbit stew filling the space. "Jonah," she said, her voice steady, "I need to go to town." Jonah did not look up from the harness he was mending. "There is nothing for you in town." "I need to see a lawyer. I need to see the county clerk. I need to know what, if anything, is left of my life." Town is Dry Chapel, he said, his voice flat. It is 30 miles, and it is a viper's nest. Pike owns the bank owns the saloon, and the saloon owns the sheriff. You will find no help there. Then I will find the truth there, Ruth said. I will not be a ghost. Jonah, I will not just float away because a man told me I was dismissed. He finally looked at her, his pale eyes searching her face. He saw no fear. He saw only a cold, settled resolve. He gave a single, sharp nod. I will hitch the wagon in the morning. Dry Chapel was exactly as he had described it, only worse. It was a single, dusty street gouged into the dry earth. On one side stood the Dry Chapel saloon, the bank a grand false front of new lumber, and the small, neat sign of Silas Pike, attorney at law. On the other side, as if in direct opposition, stood the First Presbyterian Church and Maya Redbird's apothecary. The rumor mill did not just move faster than the wind. It was the wind, a constant, whispering current that touched everyone. As Ruth tied the mule to the hitching post, every eye on the street turned to her. She was the woman from the failed Callahan ranch. She was the old woman living out at the Hale place. The whispers were audible. She ignored them and went straight to the county clerk's office, a small, stuffy room in the back of the bank building. A young man with a green eye shade. Deputy Tully looked up, his expression one of weary kindness. Ma'am, he said, his voice soft, can I help you? I am Ruth Callahan. I am here to see the papers filed by Silas Pike against the property of Ephraim Callahan. Deputy Tully winced. He knew who she was. He pulled the heavy ledger book. Yes, ma'am. The foreclosure is final. The bank took possession 3 days ago. I am truly sorry. I understand that part, Ruth said, her hands gripping the wooden counter. What I do not understand is my standing. I was his wife for 40 years. The deputy's face clouded with discomfort. He shuffled some papers. Mrs. Callahan, there seems to be a complication when Mr. Pike filed the foreclosure. He also filed a query on the title. We cannot find any record of your marriage. Ruth's blood ran cold. What do you mean? You cannot find it. We were married in 1852. A traveling preacher, Reverend Gideon. He turned the ledger for her to see. The page for that month was half empty. The Reverend, it seemed, had either forgotten to file the paperwork or had died before he reached the county seat. For 40 years, she had been Mrs. Ephraim Callahan. In the eyes of the law, she had been nothing at all. But the house, the land, it was our home, she whispered, the words catching in her throat. The mortgage papers, ma'am, Deputy Tully said, his voice full of pity. The deed was only ever in Mr. Callahan's name. It was common. The loan was made to him. The default was his. Legally, you have no claim. The bank's right is absolute. She felt the floor drop out from under her. She was not just penniless. She was erased. She was not a wife, not a widow. She was simply a woman who had lived in a man's house for 4 decades. She walked out of the clerk's office, her legs unsteady. She crossed the street, moving purely on instinct, and found herself standing in front of Silas Pike's office. He was there, visible through the clean glass, sitting at his large oak desk. He saw her and smiled, a thin, satisfied motion, and waved her in. Mrs. Callahan, he said, rising, or perhaps, under the circumstances, Mrs. will not do. What can I do for you? His voice was the same smooth, oiled wood she remembered. You knew, she said. It was not a question. I am a thorough man, he replied. One must be in my profession. When Mr. Callahan sought his loan, he was vague on his marital status. I simply clarified the record. A terrible oversight. That preacher, but fortunate for the bank. It makes for a much cleaner title. No spousal rights to contest. What do you want with the willow draw water, she demanded, the question sharp. Pike's smile widened. He was a man enjoying his victory. The railroad. My dear woman, it is coming through. And railroads. Like men, get thirsty. They will pay a premium for guaranteed water, the spring that feeds Mr. Hale's little ranch, and your former ranch, is the most reliable source in this county. And I intend to own it. He sat back, steepling his fingers. I would advise you to move on. There is nothing for you here. Mr. Hale is technically squatting on land whose water rights are now in dispute. And you are a vagrant. I would hate to have the sheriff remove you. Ruth left. She did not run. She walked, each step a measured act of fury. She saw the county council was in session at the saloon, their regular meeting place. Driven by a desperate, hopeless anger, she walked straight in. The saloon went silent. The councilmen, 5 men in dark suits, stopped their discussion and stared at her. "Gentlemen," Ruth said, her voice clear and carrying in the quiet room. "I am Ruth Callahan, and Silas Pike, on behalf of the bank, has just informed me that I am a vagrant." One of the men, the council head, cleared his throat. "Ma'am, this is a private meeting, and your business is with the bank. It is a legal matter, not a county one. You should go home." Ruth gave a short, bitter laugh. It was a terrible sound. "Which home would that be?" "Sir, the one the bank stole from me this week, or the one your laws tell me I never had for 40 years. There was a murmur. Deputy Tully, who had followed her in, looked at the floor. The men were embarrassed, but unmoved. "Ma'am," the council head said, his voice hardening, "we cannot help you. Good day." She turned and walked out, her back straight as a steel rod. The whispers of the town followed her, but this time they were mixed with something new. A few of the women watching from the boardwalk, widows who knew the sharp end of the law, nodded at her. It was not pity. It was a grim salute. She felt a wave of dizziness and leaned against a post. Her head was swimming. The shock, the anger, the humiliation. It was too much. A shadow fell over her. She looked up and saw a woman standing in front of her. The woman's skin was the color of rich, dark earth, and her black hair was woven with streaks of gray. Her eyes were sharp and intelligent. It was Maya Redbird, from the apothecary. "You look like you need water, not whiskey," the woman said, her voice quiet but firm. "Come inside." Ruth followed her into the shop. It smelled of sage, sweetgrass, and 1,000 dry, strange herbs. Maya handed her a cup of water, and then a small tin of tea, willow bark. "It will clear your head." Maya watched her drink. "You are the woman from the Hale place," she said. "I am. Silas Pike is a spider. He thinks because he can write a thing on paper, it makes it true. My people were here before his paper. We know the water. He wants to own the spring itself. He wants to dam it and sell it to the Iron Horse, and let the rest of this valley turn to dust." "How do you stop him?" Ruth asked, her voice barely a whisper. Maya looked out the window at Pike's office. "You cannot stop him with his paper. You must find an older paper, or an older truth." Ruth finished the tea, the bitterness of it grounding her. She thanked Maya Redbird, who simply nodded. As she left, she saw Reverend Amos, the pastor, standing on the church steps. He had clearly witnessed the scene at the saloon. He looked at her, his face a mask of conflict, wanting to help but clearly afraid of the forces at play. He gave her a weak, sympathetic nod and hurried inside his church. The ride back to Willow Draw was silent. Jonah did not ask. He just drove, his face set. When they arrived, Ruth finally told him everything. The invalid marriage, the legal erasure, Pike's threat to label her a vagrant, Pike's plan for the railroad and the water. Jonah's face, which she had thought incapable of showing fear, went pale. She could see it in his eyes. He was terrified. He had built his entire life on being left alone, on staying out of the way. And now, she had brought the entire weight of the modern world down on his small, quiet refuge. "Ruth," he said, his voice rough. "You cannot stay here." She stared at him, the stew congealing, forgotten, in its pot. "I mean it," he said, standing up, his hands clenching. "I saved you from the storm, but I cannot save you from him. He will use you to take my land. He will say I am harboring you, that it is improper. He will file an injunction. He will bring the sheriff. He will ruin this place just to get his water. You have to go, for your own safety, for mine." It was the final betrayal. It was Ephraim leaving. It was the council turning its back. It was the law erasing her. And now Jonah, the one man who had shown her simple, decent kindness, was casting her out. She stood up slowly, her whole body aching, but her spine felt like it had been replaced with iron. "No," she said. Jonah blinked. "What?" "No, I will not go. I have been running my whole life. Jonah, running to keep a house clean, running to make ends meet, running from pity, running from shame. Ephraim took my past. Silas Pike took my present. I will not let you give away my future." She stepped closer to him, her eyes blazing with the banked coals that had finally, fully ignited. "I am 58 years old. I have nowhere left to go, and I am done running. At my age, the only place left to run is toward myself. And I am right here. This is your home. He is trying to take your water. If you tell me to leave, I will. I will walk out into that desert and take my chances, but I will not do it to make you safe. I will only do it because you are a coward." The word hung in the air between them, sharp and glittering as a knife. Jonah recoiled as if she had struck him. His face flushed a dark, angry red. "I am not a coward. I am a realist." "Then be a realist," she shot back. "He is coming for you whether I am here or not. He told me. He wants the water. You think he cares about your deed? He will find a way, just as he did with mine." The fight went out of him, replaced by a deep, weary dread. He sat down heavily. "Then what are we to do? His paper is stronger than my fence." Ruth's mind was racing, fueled by anger and Maya Redbird's words. An older paper, an older truth. She went to her trunk, the one he had saved from the wagon. She knelt and opened it, digging beneath the quilts, beneath her needles and threads. She pulled out the rolled, yellowed canvas map her father had left her. "I told you my father was a prospector," she said, her voice quiet and intense. "He was here, in these mountains, before the town, before the county lines were even drawn." She spread the map on the rough wooden table, pushing aside their uneaten dinner. Jonah leaned over it, his eyes tracing the faded lines drawn in waterproof ink. It was a map of the high plateau, and it was astonishingly accurate. And there, marked with a small, precise X, was the spring. Her father had named it Willow Draw. "Look," Ruth said, her calloused finger pointing to a scrawl of notes in the margin. "May 1853. Water drawn, good flow, sweet. Sluice built for camp use. June 1855. He was here. He used this water. He built a sluice. Jonah. Almost 40 years ago." Jonah stared at the map, his mind working. "The law," he said slowly. "The territorial law. They call it prior appropriation. First in time, first in right." He looked at her, his eyes wide. "My father bought this land from the railroad in '69. But if your father was here, if he used the water, and this map can prove it." "It is not just a claim to your land," Ruth said, the realization dawning on her. "It is a claim to the water itself, a claim that is older than the bank, older than the railroad, older than Silas Pike and all his empty, evil paper." As if summoned by their words, a new sound came from outside, the heavy rumble of a large wagon, the jangle of survey chains. They both went to the window, in the deep twilight. A team of men was at the edge of Jonah's property, pounding stakes into the ground. A large, official-looking wagon, far more threatening than the lone foreman, was parked on the ridge. They looked at each other. The map laid out between them on the table, a single, flickering lamp illuminating the old ink. The fight had come to them. The paper was drawn. The survey lines were being staked. And in the small, besieged cabin, two old, solitary people stood side by side, a fragile alliance forged against the coming dark. The survey stakes were an act of war. They marched in a straight, unnatural line across the landscape, a declaration that the land was no longer a place, but a commodity. The drought, as if in league with Silas Pike, tightened its grip. The sun was not a source of life, but a tormentor, bleaching the sky to a shimmering, hostile white. The wind was a hot breath from an open furnace, carrying the smell of dust and dying things. It whipped Ruth's skirts against her legs and cracked the skin on her lips. One morning, Jonah came in from the north pasture, his face a grim mask. A calf, one of the new ones, had stumbled in a dry wash and broken its foreleg. They spent the better part of the day in the heat, with Ruth holding the terrified animal still while Jonah, his large hands surprisingly gentle, set the bone and fashioned a splint from barrel staves and strips of canvas. As she worked, her fingers slick with the animal's sweat, she looked at the well near the cabin. The dark, damp stone that marked the usual water level was now a full 3 feet above the surface of the water. The well, like the land, was slowly dying of thirst. Every drop they used was a prayer, and they did not know if it was being heard. 2 days later, the real invasion began. A heavy wagon, larger than the survey crews, arrived, pulled by 4 stout mules. With it came Pike's foreman and a half-dozen sullen, hard-faced men. They did not come to the cabin. They went directly to the creek bed that marked the edge of Jonah's property and began to unload their cargo. Heavy spools of wire, barbed wire, and a wagon load of fresh cedar posts. Jonah saw them from the barn. He dropped the pitchfork he was holding and started walking toward them, his stride long and angry, his hands clenched into fists. Ruth saw the look on his face, a cold, empty fury she had only glimpsed before, and she ran after him. By the time she caught up, Jonah was standing before the foreman, a big, red-faced man with a condescending smirk. "This is my property line," Jonah said, his voice a low growl. "This is the bank's water," the foreman retorted, patting one of the new posts. "We are just securing our asset, protecting it from unauthorized use." Behind him, the men began to dig post holes, the thud of the diggers a steady, rhythmic insult. They were not just building a fence, they were laying a siege. One of the men wheeled a strange, newfangled contraption to the edge of the trickling creek. It was a hand pump, attached to a long, flexible hose. "What is that for?" Ruth asked, her voice sharp. "Just taking a sample, ma'am," the foreman said, his eyes glinting. "Gotta run some tests. Check the potability, the mineral content. It is all part of a scientific process." His words were designed to confuse and intimidate, a smokescreen of progress to hide the simple fact of theft. "You are not putting that fence on my land," Jonah said, taking a step forward. "Jonah, wait," Ruth said, putting a hand on his arm. His muscles were rigid as stone. The foreman's smirk widened. "I have a court order, old man, signed by the judge himself. Says we can have access for survey and assessment. You lay a hand on me or my men, and Deputy Tully will be out here to haul you in." "I ought to—" Jonah started, his whole body shaking with a rage that seemed to come from a place deeper than just the fence. Ruth squeezed his arm, hard. She stepped between him and the foreman, her small, straight figure a surprising barrier. "Sir," she said, her voice devoid of heat but full of an unyielding authority, "the court order may give you access, but the matter of the water rights themselves is not yet settled. We have filed a petition." The foreman laughed. "A short, ugly bark. A petition that and a nickel will get you a cup of dirty coffee. The law is paper, ma'am, and we have the paper." "The law," Ruth replied, her eyes locked on his, "does not belong to anyone until it is spoken in full. You may have a piece of paper. We have a claim that is 40 years older than your bank. Now, You do your scientific process, but you will do it on that side of the property line, and we will see what the judge has to say when he has heard the whole story." Her calm, reasoned words did what Jonah's fury could not. They introduced a note of doubt. The foreman scowled. Robbed of his physical confrontation, he grunted at his men, and they grudgingly moved the pump a few feet back, to the other side of the invisible line. The confrontation was over, for now, but the fence posts stood like raw new tombstones, and the sound of the digging continued all day. That evening, the silence in the cabin was thick with unspoken things. Jonah sat staring into the fire, his hands turning a piece of wood over and over. Ruth knew she had to break it. "Jonah," she said softly, "you need to tell me why you were so afraid." He flinched at the word afraid, but he did not deny it. He took a long, shuddering breath. "Ethan, my son, I told you he died over a fence. I did not tell you the rest." He began to speak, his voice low and haunted, the words coming out as if they had been locked away for a decade. "The homesteader who put up the wire. His name was Miller, a stubborn, frightened man. When Ethan went to cut the fence, Miller was waiting, but he was not alone. He had brought 2 other men with him. They did not just stop him. They made an example of him. It was not a clean fight. It was cruel. When I found him, there was nothing I could do." He looked up at Ruth, his pale eyes swimming with a pain so raw it was like an open wound. "I went for the sheriff. I told him what happened. He called it a dispute over property. Said Ethan was trespassing, that he was committing a crime. Miller claimed self-defense. The other 2 men were his witnesses. It was my word against theirs. There was no trial. There was no justice. There was just a fence and my boy in the ground. So I stopped fighting." He whispered, "I learned to be quiet. I learned that their paper, their laws, they are not for men like me. Violence is the only thing they understand, and it is a fight I already lost once. I cannot lose it again." Ruth's heart ached for him. She reached out and, for the first time, laid her hand over his. His skin was rough, but he did not pull away. He simply turned his hand over and held hers, his grip surprisingly tight. They sat like that for a long time, 2 survivors in the flickering firelight. In the days that followed, Ruth became a different woman. Her hands, so used to the fine, precise work of a needle, learned a new trade. She spent her days with her father's map and a set of old geology surveys she had ordered from the state capital. She learned to read the contours of the land, to understand the language of rock strata and water tables. She bought a ledger book in Dry Chapel and began to keep a log. Every morning, she measured the water level in the well, noting the drop, a fraction of an inch at a time. She recorded the wind, the heat, the state of the pasture. She was no longer just a seamstress. She was a chronicler, a keeper of the water, a guardian of this small, besieged piece of the world. Her late life, which she had thought was an ending, had become a fierce and unexpected education. Their alliance with the town grew. Maya Redbird, with her clear, sharp mind, had helped Ruth draft the legal petition for an injunction, citing the doctrine of prior appropriation based on her father's map. Reverend Amos, his conscience finally winning out over his caution, took the petition to his congregation. He gathered 24 signatures, mostly from the widows and the small, independent ranchers who knew that if Pike could take Jonah's water, he could take anyone's. The town was dividing. The merchants and councilmen who depended on the bank's favor sided with Pike, but the people who worked the land, the people who understood the sacred importance of water, they were beginning to stand with the old man and the strange woman at Willow Draw. The tension was a constant presence, but within the walls of the small cabin, something else was growing. A quiet, comfortable partnership. They worked together without needing to speak, their movements falling into a familiar rhythm. One evening, as Jonah sat down to the familiar meal of beans and cornbread, Ruth looked at him, a playful glint in her eye. "I have figured you out," Jonah Hale, she said. He looked up, wary. You have two favorite things in this world, she continued. Brown beans and stubbornness. He chewed his cornbread thoughtfully. He looked at the beans, then back at her. A slow smile, the one she was beginning to know, spread across his face. Well, he said, I am cutting back on the beans. Their shared laughter was a small act of rebellion against the fear that surrounded them. A week later, Ruth made a discovery. She was walking in the south pasture, a wide, arid field dotted with tough, spiky yucca plants. It was considered the worst part of the ranch, dry and useless. But something in her father's notes, a comment about yucca thriving where the deep water flows, had stuck in her mind. She looked at the pattern of the plants. They were not random. They grew in a distinct, meandering line, a faint, ghostly echo of a river flowing far beneath the sun-baked earth. She raced back to the cabin, her heart pounding with a new, wild hope. She grabbed the geology maps and her father's canvas, spreading them out on the table. Jonah, look, she said, her finger tracing the line of yucca she had drawn. It matches the fault line on the geology survey. And look here, what my father wrote. Deep aquifer. Follows the yucca line. He thought there was water down there. A lot of it. Jonah stared at the map, his practical rancher's mind slowly accepting the incredible possibility. An underground river. If they could sink a deep well. Right there, they would not need the spring. They would not need the creek. They could have their own water, independent of Silas Pike and his fences and his paper laws. They could be free. The hope was a dazzling, brilliant light, but it was immediately followed by a long, dark shadow. How Jonah asked, his voice flat, the hope already fading from his face. A deep well, that takes a drilling rig. It takes pipe. It takes money. More money than I have seen in 20 years. And even if they had the money, Ruth realized. The injunction worked both ways. Pike's court order gave him access for assessment, but it also froze any new development on the property until the ownership of the water rights was settled. They could not drill. The law, which she had hoped to use as a shield, was now also their prison. They had found the path to survival, a secret river of hope flowing right beneath their feet. But it was 1,000 feet down, and the way to it was blocked by the two most powerful forces in the West, a lack of money, and a man who knew how to use the law like a weapon. The rain came without warning. For weeks, the sky had been a cruel, empty bowl of polished brass. Then, one afternoon, the brass tarnished. The air grew thick and heavy, tasting of ozone and distant dust. Clouds the color of deep bruises gathered on the western horizon. And then they were upon them. A sudden, violent deluge that hammered the parched earth. It was not a gentle, life-giving shower. It was a storm, a battle. The sky trying to beat the land into submission. The water streamed off the cabin roof in brown sheets, carving new channels in the hard-packed dirt. The sound was a deafening roar, a solid wall of noise that blotted out all thought. Ruth and Jonah stood on the small covered porch, watching the world dissolve into a gray, churning chaos. They did not speak. There were no words big enough for the moment. They simply watched the water, a gift so long withheld it felt like a miracle and a punishment all at once. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world washed clean and utterly transformed. The air, once thick with dust, was now crisp and cool, carrying the intoxicating scent of wet sage and damp earth, a perfume the desert only wore on the rarest of occasions. The next morning, the sun rose into a sky of impossible clarity, and the land, the hard, unforgiving land that Ruth had thought was only capable of producing rock and thorn, had answered the rain. It was a quiet magic. On the slopes of the bluffs, where yesterday there had been only brown scree, there were now patches of brilliant orange from blooming globe mallow. Along the newly revived creek bed, delicate, spurred blossoms of columbine nodded in the gentle breeze. The entire basin, which had been a study in grays and browns, was now stippled with the tiny, fierce colors of wildflowers. A secret tapestry revealed by the storm. Life had not been absent, it had only been waiting. Jonah found her by the corral, her gaze lost in the wonder of a patch of purple verbena that had sprung up overnight. He stood beside her for a long moment, following her gaze. "Come," he said, his voice quiet. "There is something you should see." He led her not on horseback, but on foot, walking slowly up the long, gentle slope of the hill that sheltered the cabin from the north wind. The ground was soft under their feet, and with every step, the clean scent of the damp soil rose around them. He took her to a place she had not been before, a small, hidden terrace just below the rim of the bluff. And there, the miracle was complete. An entire swath of the hillside was ablaze with color, a wild garden planted by nothing more than wind and water and time. He stopped and simply looked at it, at the sea of orange and yellow and purple. He gestured with his hand, a small, rough movement that encompassed the whole scene. "People think the desert is dead," he said, his voice a low rumble, barely louder than the wind. "They think it is empty, but it is not. It is just waiting for the right rain." Ruth looked from the flowers to his face. She saw the lines etched by sun and sorrow, but she also saw the quiet wonder in his pale eyes. He was not just talking about the desert. He was talking about them. He was telling her that he, too, had been waiting, a parched and fallow land, for a rain he had long since given up on. The wind picked up, a cool current that carried the scent of the blossoms. Ruth shivered, and without a thought, Jonah moved closer, his shoulder brushing against hers, a small, solid shield against the chill. She leaned into his warmth, a simple, instinctive gesture of trust. He did not stiffen or pull away. He accepted the small weight of her as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Slowly, as if it were a thought he was just now discovering, he reached out and took her hand. His fingers were rough, the skin thick with calluses, but his touch was gentle. Her own hand, calloused and work-worn in its own right, fit into his. It was a connection of two people who understood the language of hard work and quiet survival. He turned to face her, his eyes searching hers, and then he leaned in and kissed her. It was a slow, tentative kiss, as soft and as unexpected as the rain. It was not a kiss of passion, but of recognition. It was a kiss that said, "I see you." For Ruth, it was a revelation. For 40 years, she had been an appendage, a useful part of Ephraim's life, a presence so familiar she had become invisible. His touch had been one of habit, not of seeing. This was different, this simple meeting of lips, here on this windswept hill surrounded by impossible flowers, made her tremble. It was the touch of a man who saw not an old woman, not a discarded wife, but a person. A woman who, like the desert, was not dead, but waiting. When he pulled back, he kept her hand in his. They stood in the quiet, the only sound the whisper of the wind through the sage. "I cannot promise you riches." "Ruth," Jonah said, his voice thick with an emotion she could not name. "I cannot promise you an easy life. This place is hard, the world is hard. But I can promise you this, I will water what you believe in." Ruth looked at their joined hands, then up at his earnest, weathered face. A slow smile spread across her lips, a smile that reached the warm, banked coals of her eyes and made them glow. "I believe in sprouts. Jonah," she said softly, "I believe in new beginnings." Later that day, she brought one of her quilts, the one with the log cabin pattern, up to the hidden terrace. She spread the heavy, hand-stitched fabric over a patch of soft grass between the flowers. The quilt, with its thousands of tiny, perfect stitches, its scraps of old cloth given new life, felt like a statement. It was a home, patched together from the remnants of what was, but strong and warm and built to last. They sat on it together as the afternoon sun slanted across the valley, turning the distant mountains a soft, hazy purple. They shared a meal of bread and cheese, and they talked. They talked of small things, of the stubborn calf with its splinted leg, of the best way to preserve peaches, of the feel of different threads under a needle. It was a conversation of profound and simple peace. The air hummed with the sound of insects, and the rich smell of the earth rose around them. A benison. It was a moment of rest, a deep, collective sigh before the next inevitable storm. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, a new and different quiet settled between them. "I want to stay," Ruth said, the words coming out clear and simple, without a trace of the shame or uncertainty that had haunted her. She was not asking for charity. She was stating a fact, a desire she had finally allowed herself to own. Jonah turned to her, his profile stark against the twilight. His hand found hers again on the quilt. "Stay," he said. The word was not a plea. It was a foundation. It was the first post hole for a new fence, one meant to keep a person in, not out. It was the quiet, final answer to the fear that had ruled him for a decade. He was a man who had lost everything to violence and conflict, and he was finally, quietly, choosing to build again. They sat in the companionable darkness, the quilt warm beneath them, the vast, starry sky arching overhead. It was a perfect, fragile moment of peace. And then, far off to the east, on the ridge that marked the edge of the world, a light appeared. It was not a star. It was too bright, too yellow. It moved slowly, a single, searching eye in the immense darkness. It was a lantern, carried by a rider, or perhaps mounted on a wagon. It was the light of the survey crew, the light of Silas Pike. It traced the fence line they had built, a cold, sharp reminder that their small, blossoming world was still under siege. The war was not over. It had only been paused for the rain. The peace born of the rain was as fragile as the wildflowers. It lasted less than a week. The blow, when it came, was not from a fence post or a court order, but from the printed page, the Dry Chapel Chronicle. A thin, gossipy sheet owned by a cousin of Silas Pike published a story on its front page. The headline was cruel and direct. A widow with no wedding. A claim with no water. The article was a masterpiece of insinuation. It painted Ruth as a schemer, a woman of questionable history who, having been cast out of one home, had attached herself to a lonely, vulnerable old rancher. It twisted her legal situation into a moral failing, hinting that her 40-year union with Ephraim had been a sham from the start. It called her a parasite, seeking to leech water and sympathy from a community that owed her nothing. The peak of the social conflict had arrived, and it was a public shaming. Maya Redbird brought them a copy. She rode out to the ranch, her face grim. "He is not just trying to take your land," she said, her voice tight with anger. "He is trying to take your name." Jonah read the article, his face turning a dark, dangerous red. He crumpled the newspaper into a tight ball and threw it into the fire, where it flared up and vanished into smoke. But the words, the poison, remained hanging in the air. Ruth felt a cold sickness in the pit of her stomach. She had faced pity and whispers, but this was a deliberate, public branding. It was an attempt to make her so loathsome that no one would dare to stand with her. The legal maneuver followed swiftly. Deputy Tully rode out a few days later, his expression apologetic. He handed Ruth an official notice. Silas Pike had successfully petitioned the circuit judge for an expedited hearing. The case of the Willow Draw water rights would be heard in 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Not enough time to prepare. Not enough time to find witnesses. Not enough time for anything. "And there is something else." "Ma'am," Tully said, unable to meet her eyes. "Mr. Pike filed a motion to produce the primary evidence for your claim, your father's map. The court clerk. He says he cannot find it. It seems to have been misplaced. Lost. The map. Their one tangible piece of history. Their older truth. was gone. Vanished from a locked office. It was not just a conspiracy. It was a brazen act of theft, sanitized by the language of bureaucracy. They were being stripped of their defenses one by one before they even set foot in the courtroom. Despair was a luxury they could not afford. That evening, as a profound silence filled the cabin, Ruth looked at Jonah. His shoulders were slumped, the fight seemingly gone out of him. "He has beaten us," he said, his voice a hollow whisper. Ruth walked over to the stove and began to methodically grind coffee beans. The small, rhythmic, practical sound was an anchor in the swirling chaos. "No," she said, not looking at him. "He has taken our map. He has not taken the water. He has taken our time. He has not taken our will." She poured him a cup of coffee. "Tomorrow," she said, her voice firm, "we build." And so they worked. Love, for them, was not found in whispered words or stolen glances. It was found in the shared rhythm of labor, in the grunt of effort and the sweat that dripped from their brows under the punishing sun. They abandoned the failing well and the contested spring. All their hope now lay in the secret river beneath the yucca field. They began digging a new irrigation ditch, a long, deep trench that would carry water from the spot where the new well would one day be. The work was brutal. The ground was hard as iron, and they had only shovels and a single stubborn mule. They worked from sunrise to sunset, their hands blistering, their backs aching. They moved as a team, a silent, efficient partnership. Then they started on the windmill. It was a kit Jonah had bought years ago and never assembled, a collection of wood and metal that had lain rusting behind the barn. Now it was their monument to defiance. They laid the foundation. They assembled the complex gears. Slowly, a tall skeletal tower rose from the dust, a promise of water drawn from the deep earth. And the community, which had been so swayed by Pike's newspaper, began to watch. They saw the old man and the strange woman working not like victims, but like pioneers. They saw the ditch lengthen foot by painful foot. They saw the tower grow. One afternoon, a wagon creaked to a halt on the trail. It was two of the widows from the church, the ones who had nodded at Ruth in grim salute. They did not say much. They simply left a fresh loaf of bread, still warm from the oven, and a jar of cool water on a fence post. It was the first crack in the wall of scorn. A few days later, another neighbor stopped by, leaving a sack of potatoes. The whispers in town did not stop, but their tone began to change. The story was no longer just about a scheming woman. It was about two old, stubborn people who refused to be broken. The sky, which had given them the gift of rain, returned with a vengeance. One hot, dry afternoon, the air grew thick and yellow. A bolt of lightning, jagged and purple, split the sky to the west, striking the high ridge. It was a dry strike. No rain followed, only smoke. At first it was just a thin gray plume against the horizon, but the wind was blowing their way. Within an hour, the plume had become a churning, angry cloud of brown smoke, and they could see a line of orange flame licking at the base of the ridge, a grass fire, and it was moving fast. "The cattle!" Jonah yelled, his face tight with alarm. The small herd was in the north pasture, directly in the fire's path. There was no time for debate, no time for fear. Ruth, who had spent her life controlling the tiny, precise world of needle and thread, took command. Her mind, honed by decades of solving practical problems, saw the landscape as a piece of cloth to be cut and stitched. "We need a fire break," she shouted over the rising roar. "Here at the narrow part of the valley we can burn a line back toward it." Jonah did not question her. He saw the logic in her plan. It was their only chance. They grabbed shovels and wet sacks. He rode ahead on his horse, starting a controlled backfire, a line of flame designed to consume the fuel before the main blaze arrived. Ruth followed on foot, beating out the edges of the new fire with a wet burlap sack, keeping it from jumping their line. The heat was an inferno. The smoke was a choking, blinding fog. Embers rained down around them. setting small spot fires that she had to race to extinguish. The main fire was a living thing now, a monstrous, roaring beast that devoured the dry grass with a sound like a freight train. In the swirling smoke, disaster struck. Jonah's horse, panicked by a shower of sparks, reared violently. He was thrown, his body landing hard against the rocky ground. He cried out, a sharp, terrible sound of pain. Ruth ran to him. He was trying to push himself up, his face pale and beaded with sweat. His left arm was bent at a sickening, unnatural angle. Broken. "I am old," he gasped, the words a mixture of pain and disgust. Ruth knelt beside him, her heart pounding, but her voice was steady. She looked from his broken arm to the rapidly approaching wall of flame. "You are old," she said, meeting his pain-filled eyes. "And you are still brilliant. Now, help me get you up." They laughed, a raw, ragged sound in the heart of the smoky chaos. It was a laugh of pure, desperate defiance. She managed to get him to his feet, his good arm draped over her shoulder, and half dragged him back toward the safety of the cabin, away from the firebreak. The backfire was holding, but the main blaze was still a terrifying threat. As they reached the cabin, Deputy Tully rode into the yard, his face smudged with soot. Saw the smoke, he yelled, "The whole town is coming!" Behind him, a ragged line of wagons and riders was on the trail. A small, brave army armed with shovels and water buckets. Reverend Amos was among them, his suit coat abandoned, his sleeves rolled up. Maya Redbird was there, her wagon loaded with burn salves and bandages. The community, swayed not by words but by the sight of their courage, had come. The fire raged for hours, but with the help of the townspeople, they held the line. As dawn broke, the fire had burned itself out against their firebreak, leaving behind a vast, blackened scar on the land. The cabin and the herd were safe. In the exhausted, smoky aftermath, Deputy Tully approached Ruth. He was holding a small, leather-bound book. "I went to see the court clerk," he said, his voice low. "Had a long talk with him, about honesty, and about what happens when good people are pushed too far. He felt remorseful. He gave me this. It was a private ledger, Silas Pike's ledger. In it, in Pike's own neat, arrogant hand, were records of payments, consulting fees, he called them, from the Union Pacific Railroad Company. The payments corresponded exactly with the dates he had filed the mortgage against Ephraim's land and the petition to seize Jonah's water. It was not just a suspicion. It was proof. Proof of collusion. Proof of extortion. It was the modern, dirty truth that was even more powerful than her father's old map. Ruth took the ledger, her hand trembling slightly. She looked over at Jonah. His arm was now splinted and in a sling Maya had fashioned. He was in pain, but his eyes were clear. The remaining cattle, spooked and scattered, needed to be moved from the burned pasture to the safety of the main corral. It was a job for a seasoned rancher, a job for him, but he could not do it. He looked at Ruth. He nodded toward the horse. "You," he said. The word was an order, a gift, an abdication. "You lead them." He, Jonah Hale, the man who had lost his son to a fence, the man who trusted nothing but his own solitude, was handing her the reins. He was trusting her, a seamstress, with his livelihood, with the last remnant of his life's work. He was trusting her the way a man in the desert trusts the promise of a coming rain. Later, as the sun set over the blackened, wounded, but safe valley, Reverend Amos came to her. He stood beside her, looking at the weary townspeople preparing to leave. "Justice sometimes comes, Mrs. Callahan," he said quietly, "but it is often a slow and reluctant visitor. It does not come unless someone pounds on the door." Ruth clutched the ledger in her hand. She looked from the burned land to the rising, defiant tower of their windmill. She felt the strength of Jonah's trust, the quiet support of the community, and the cold, hard fury that had been forged in her heart. "Reverend," she said, her voice clear and steady as stone, I am not going to knock. I am going to break the door down. The ledger felt heavy in Ruth's hand. A small, dense book that contained the weight of a modern, more devious kind of wickedness. But it was also a weapon. And for the first time in a long time, she felt armed. The sense of purpose, however, was a fragile shield against the final, most personal betrayal, which arrived with the setting sun 2 days later. A smart, new buggy, pulled by a matched set of bays, rolled into the yard. 2 men were in the seat. One was Silas Pike, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. The other, sitting beside him, was Ephraim Callahan. He was clean-shaven. He wore a new suit, a fine wool that looked out of place in the dusty yard of Willow Draw. He looked prosperous and rested. He did not look like a man who had spent 40 years on a struggling ranch. He looked like a stranger. Jonah came out of the barn, his splinted arm held carefully at his side. He stood beside Ruth on the porch, a silent, solid presence. Ephraim did not look at her. He looked at the new windmill tower, at the repaired sluice, at the general order of the place, and a flicker of something annoyance perhaps crossed his face. "Ruth," he said, his voice smooth and practiced, as if he were addressing a business associate. "There has been a misunderstanding." Pike sat back, enjoying the scene. "I have come to a business arrangement with Mr. Pike," Ephraim continued, his gaze still avoiding hers. "A very profitable one for all involved. I have signed over any and all claims to the water from this territory, the spring, the creek, everything, as the legal owner of the original Callahan property, and its associated rights. It was my prerogative." He was not just a fool who had run off with a singer. He was a co-conspirator. He had been in league with Pike, selling the final remnant of their shared life for a piece of the railroad's money. He had come back not to apologize, but to deliver the finishing blow. "So you see," he said with a small, dismissive wave of his hand, "this ridiculous petition of yours is moot. The water has already been sold." Ruth felt a wave of nausea. For a brief, terrifying moment, the floor of her world gave way again. All her life, she had been an extension of him, his helpmeet, his wife, his shadow. She looked at his new suit, his smooth hands, and she almost believed the lie the newspaper had printed, that she was nothing, that her entire life had been a fiction, a long service in the house of a man who saw her as just another asset to be liquidated. Then she looked at Jonah, standing beside her, his one good arm steady, his eyes full of a quiet, protective fury. She looked at the windmill they had built together. She looked at the blackened scar on the hillside where they had fought the fire, and the sickness receded, replaced by a cold, clear calm. She went back inside the cabin without a word. Ephraim watched her go, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. She went to her trunk and took out a small, folded piece of paper. It was the marriage certificate, the one signed by the traveling preacher, the one the law had declared worthless. She walked back out onto the porch, past the 2 men, and went to the small fire pit where she cooked in the evenings. She struck a match and held it to the corner of the yellowed paper. She watched it curl, the ink of their names turning brown, then black, then disappearing into ash. She was not burning a memory. She was severing a chain. When she turned back, her face was serene. "Mr. Callahan," she said, and the formal address was a blade. "You have no standing here. This property belongs to Jonah Hale. And the water belongs to the history of this land. Not to you, not anymore." Ephraim's face flushed with anger. Pike merely smiled. "We will see you in court," he said. He flicked the reins, and the buggy turned, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. That night, the weather turned. The air grew still and cold with a terrifying speed. The temperature plummeted. A freak autumn snowstorm, a white squall, blew in from the north, a final, desperate assault from a hostile world. The wind howled, and small, hard pellets of snow began to drive against the window pane. "The cattle," Ruth said, her voice sharp with alarm. "They are still in the upper pasture. They will drift with the storm and be lost." Jonah looked at his splinted arm, a curse of helplessness on his face. "I cannot." "I can," Ruth said. Before he could argue, she was pulling on her heaviest coat and wrapping a wool shawl around her head. She took a lantern and went out into the maelstrom. The wind tore at her, and the snow was a blinding, disorienting curtain. She fought her way to the pasture, the mule following her, its head low. She found the herd huddled together, their backs to the wind, their coats already white with snow. She knew a ravine, a narrow, sheltered draw, where they could be safe. She began to drive them, her voice a sharp, steady cry against the howl of the storm. The cattle, miserable and spooked, moved reluctantly. The ground, soft from the earlier rain, was now a treacherous mixture of mud and freezing snow. The animals' hooves sank, and the effort to move them was immense. A small calf, born just after the fire, faltered. It stumbled, its legs trembling with cold, and let out a piteous cry. It could not keep up. Ruth knew it would be left behind to perish. Without a second thought, she unwrapped her log cabin quilt from her own saddle, the one she had spread on the hillside of flowers, and wrapped it around the shivering animal's body, tying it in place. She lifted the calf onto the back of her mule. Her own body was racked with cold, but the small, desperate life was more important. The snow grew thicker. The world became a churning vortex of white. She could no longer see the landmarks. The ravine she was searching for was lost. A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. She was lost. Back at the cabin, Jonah paced like a caged animal. He could not stand the waiting. He could not stand the thought of her. Out there alone, he looked at his broken arm, at the fire, at the howling darkness. His fear of loss, the ghost of his son, rose up to choke him. But this time, another fear was stronger, the fear of losing her. He pulled on his coat, his movements clumsy with his one good hand. He took every lantern he owned. He went out into the storm, saddled his horse, and rode into the white darkness. He did not know where she was. He only knew the general direction she had gone. He rode to the edge of the pasture and lit the first lantern, hanging it on a high fence post, a small, brave star in the blizzard. Then he rode on, 50 yards into the blinding snow, and hung another. He was creating a path of light, a string of hope, a way home. He was pushing past the limits of his body, past the ghost of his past, driven by a need that was stronger than his pain. Ruth, her strength failing, her sense of direction gone, saw it, a faint, distant glow through the swirling snow. She thought her eyes were playing tricks on her. Then she saw another. Further on, a line, a path. It was Jonah. She turned the herd and drove them toward the lights. As she drew closer, she could hear him shouting her name, his voice ragged against the wind. The final lantern sputtered and went out just as she reached him. "My light is out," he yelled, his voice a mix of frustration and relief. "My eyes are still bright," she shouted back, and together they found their way home. They drove the herd into the barn, the smell of warm animals and hay a welcome comfort. They left the quilt on the calf, back in the cabin. They stood dripping and shivering by the fire, the storm raging outside, their small world safe and warm. The fear that had driven them was gone, replaced by a deep, unspoken certainty. He reached out with his good hand and gently brushed a snowflake from her hair. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a moment. The fear of loss, which had haunted both of their lives, had finally been transformed into the quiet courage of commitment. They knew the fight was not over, but the long, dark night of their souls had passed. The next morning, the world was a pristine, silent blanket of white. The storm was over. Ruth looked at Jonah over her cup of coffee. "I will not run," she said. "I am going to that courthouse. I am going to stand before that judge." Jonah nodded, his face calm and resolute. "You will not stand alone," he said. I will be there. I will stand as a witness. I will tell them the story of this land and its water. I will tell them our story. They would face Silas Pike not with a lost map, but with a ledger full of his own corruption, not as a victim and a recluse, but as two people bound together by a resilience they had forged in fire and ice. They were ready. The saloon in Dry Chapel had been scrubbed clean, its floors swept of sawdust and its tables rearranged to form a makeshift courtroom. The circuit judge, a man named Harris with a face like worn leather and eyes that missed nothing, sat at a high table where whiskey deals were usually struck. The room was packed. Every chair was taken. People stood 3 deep against the back wall, the entire town having turned out for the final act of the drama that had consumed them. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, tobacco, and a palpable, vibrating tension. In the front row, Silas Pike sat beside his lawyer, looking as immaculate and confident as ever. Beside him sat Ephraim Callahan, his face arranged in lines of pious gravity, as if he were the one who had been wronged. He was a man performing his final, most duplicitous role, the respectable husband, forced to clean up a messy affair. On the other side, Ruth Callahan sat beside Jonah Hale. Jonah's arm was in a clean white sling, and his face was set in grim, determined lines. Ruth was wearing her best gray poplin, the one she had worn to church. Her hands, calloused and strong, were folded calmly in her lap, and beside her, standing to address the judge, was Maya Redbird. She wore a simple dark skirt and a white blouse, her black hair pulled back. She held no impressive leather satchel, only a thin folder of papers. When she had first announced herself as counsel for the defense, a ripple of disbelief had moved through the crowd. Maya, the apothecary. But the judge had curtly examined the papers she had filed, seen they were in perfect order, and nodded. She was a known student of the correspondence law courses from Chicago, and in a territory short on lawyers, she was permitted to speak. Silas Pike's lawyer, a slick man from Cheyenne, presented his case with devastating simplicity. A loan was made. A default occurred. The property was foreclosed. The water rights, legally attached to that property, were then sold by the rightful owner, Mr. Ephraim Callahan, to a new party. It was a simple, clean, unfortunate business transaction. He dismissed Ruth's claim as the sentimental rambling of a woman who had no legal standing whatsoever. He even had the gall to refer to the newspaper article, suggesting her entire 40-year relationship was, in the eyes of the law, a fiction. When it was Maya's turn, she was methodical. She was not a performer. She was a chemist, and she presented her facts as if she were laying out the elements of a formula. She called Ephraim Callahan to the stand. "Mr. Callahan?" she asked, her voice quiet but carrying in the stillness. "Is it not true that you abandoned your wife and your property 6 months ago?" Ephraim flushed. "I was pursuing a business opportunity. A business opportunity that involved a singer from a traveling show." "Objection," Pike's lawyer snapped. "Irrelevant and inflammatory." "Sustained," the judge said, though his eyes were cold. "Stick to the facts. Miss Redbird." Maya nodded. "Mr. Callahan, when did you first enter into discussions with Mr. Pike about selling the water rights?" "It was after the foreclosure. A man must make his way." "Are you certain?" Maya asked. She then produced a copy of a hotel ledger from Cheyenne, showing Ephraim and Silas Pike had stayed in the same hotel, on the same floor, 2 full weeks before the foreclosure notice was ever served on Ruth. Ephraim's composure cracked. He stammered about coincidence. Then Maya presented her main evidence. First, she called Reverend Amos. He testified, his voice trembling slightly, that Mr. Pike had offered a substantial consulting fee to the church, disguised as a donation. In exchange for the church leadership publicly supporting the bank's water acquisition, he had refused. Then she called Deputy Tully. "Mr. Tully, you were the custodian of the court's evidence, including the defendant's map." "Yes, ma'am." And that map was misplaced. Yes, ma'am, it was. A low murmur of anger went through the room. But, Tully continued, his voice growing stronger, given the value of that map, and given the general atmosphere in town, I took the liberty of making a certified copy before the original vanished. He produced a perfect, crisp copy of the hand-drawn map, clearly showing the date of 1853, and the note, "Sluice built for camp use." Pike's composure did not waver, but a small muscle in his jaw began to twitch. "And finally," Maya said, her voice dropping, "we have this." She held up the small, leather-bound book, Mr. Pike's private ledger. She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, this book details a series of payments from the Union Pacific Railroad, labeled as consulting fees. These payments correlate exactly with the date the original loan was made to Mr. Callahan, the date of the foreclosure, and the date of the expedited hearing. It is not a record of legal fees. It is a record of a conspiracy." The courtroom exploded. The judge hammered for order. He took the ledger, his eyes scanning the pages, his face growing darker with every line. When the room was quiet, Maya Redbird called her final witness, Ruth Callahan. Ruth walked to the stand and took the oath. Pike's lawyer rose for the cross-examination, his voice dripping with contempt. "Mrs. Callahan, or perhaps I should not use that title. Is it not true you have no legal claim to the name that you lived with this man for 40 years, without the benefit of marriage?" "I lived with him as his wife," Ruth said, her voice clear. "I ran his house. I worked his land. I bore our life together. The paper was lost. My life was not. And now you are living with Mr. Hale, a man you are not related to." "I am living at Willow Draw, yes." The lawyer smiled, turning to the crowd. "So, a woman of flexible loyalties. Who is to say you did not create this copy of a fantasy map?" The room was tense. The women in the audience looked down, ashamed. Ruth sat straight, her gaze never wavering. She did not look at her questioner. She looked at the judge. "Your Honor," she said, her voice ringing out, sharp and true as her best needle, "I am not here to ask for pity. My personal life, which these men have seen fit to print in a newspaper and mock in this court, is not on trial. I am not here to ask you to like me. I am here to ask for the law." She leaned forward. "The law says first in time, first in right. My father was here, and this map, this copy of a map that Mr. Pike's associates stole, proves it. The law says that fraud invalidates a contract. Mr. Pike's own book is a record of his fraud. I am not asking you to bend the rules for a poor, abandoned woman. I am asking you to apply them fairly. For 40 years, I have been told my opinion did not matter because I am a woman. Today, I am asking you to see the truth. I am asking for the law to be applied equally, not just to the men with the newest suits and the most powerful friends." A profound silence fell, and then, from the back, one of the widows began to clap. A slow, steady sound. Another joined her, then another. The men in the audience, the ranchers and shopkeepers, looked at each other. Their expressions of suspicion and judgment had softened. They were looking at Silas Pike with a new, cold anger. The social conflict that had isolated her was cracking. Jonah, watching from his seat, felt an unease that had nothing to do with the trial. His rancher's instincts were screaming. He looked at Silas Pike, who, despite the ledger, still seemed to have an ace up his sleeve. Pike glanced at the clock on the wall, then at his foreman, who was standing by the door. The foreman gave a tiny nod and slipped out of the saloon. Jonah knew Pike was not just fighting in the courtroom. He was a man who hedged his bets. Jonah stood up, his chair scraping loudly on the floor. "Judge," he shouted, his voice a raw bark. "They are at the creek. They are going to blow the spring." The courtroom devolved into chaos. Jonah did not wait for permission. He ran from the room, his broken arm in its sling, shouting, Not fire the creek. They are at the spring. He sprinted the 50 yards to the church and grabbed the thick bell rope with his one good hand. The deep, frantic clang of the church bell, the sound of fire or disaster, rang out across the valley. The entire courtroom emptied. The judge, Pike, Ephraim, Ruth, Maya, and every citizen of Dry Chapel ran, hiked, and stumbled the half-mile to Willow Draw, following Jonah. They arrived, breathless, to a scene of desperate sabotage. At the narrowest point of the draw, where the spring emerged from the rocks, Pike's foreman and 2 other men were ramming charges of dynamite into the crevices. "Stop!" Deputy Tully yelled, drawing his sidearm. The foreman, his face a mask of sweat and panic, jammed the last stick in and lit a long fuse. It sputtered to life, a hissing, smoky snake racing toward the explosives. "Get back," he screamed. "This is bank property. We are clearing an obstruction." Silas Pike pushed through the crowd, his face purple with rage. His plan was exposed. He pulled a sleek revolver from under his coat. "It is over, old man," he yelled at Jonah, who had come to stand beside Ruth. "The water is mine." He raised the pistol and aimed it directly at Jonah Hale. Jonah did not flinch. He simply moved, putting his own body between the gun and Ruth. The fuse hissed. It was seconds away from the charges. Ruth's mind, forged in crisis, saw everything at once. The gun, the determined look on Jonah's face, the sputtering fuse, and she saw, 10 feet to her left, the heavy wooden lever for the sluice gate, the gate she had repaired, the small holding pond behind it, swollen with the water from the recent rains. While every eye was on Pike and his gun, Ruth lunged. She grabbed the lever, a thick beam of waterlogged wood. It was stiff. She put her foot against the frame and threw her entire body, all 130 pounds of grit and fury, against it. With a groan of protesting wood, the gate gave way. A solid, surging wall of cold. Clear water burst from the holding pond. It did not trickle, it roared. It surged down the sluice and into the creek bed. A sudden, violent flash flood. It struck the sputtering fuse with the force of a battering ram, drowning it instantly. It hit the dynamite charges, washing them harmlessly from the rocks. It slammed into the foreman and his men, knocking them off their feet and sending them tumbling into the icy, churning water. A moment of stunned, dripping silence. Deputy Tully was the first to move. He holstered his gun and walked forward as Pike stared, his pistol hanging limply at his side. His grand plan washed away. "Silas Pike," Tully said, his voice hard as iron, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, extortion, witness tampering, and attempted destruction of property." He took the gun from Pike's unresisting hand. Ephraim Callahan, seeing his benefactor in cuffs and his own future in ruins, made a desperate, panicked break for it. He turned to flee, to scramble back up the muddy bank and lose himself in the crowd. But his fine, new city boots, slick with mud, found no purchase. He slipped, his arms windmilling, and tumbled backward, landing in an undignified, muddy heap at the edge of the creek he had tried to sell. He looked up, his face a mask of complete and utter humiliation. His new suit was ruined. His pride was gone. Ruth walked over to him. She looked down at the man who had been the center of her world for 40 years. He was just a man, a weak, selfish, broken man. She extended her hand. He took it, his grip desperate, and she pulled him to his feet. He stood before her, covered in mud. "Ruth," he stammered, his voice pleading. "Ruth, She looked at him, and for the first time she felt nothing. Not anger, not love, not even hatred. Just a vast, empty pity. "I forgive you, Ephraim," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "For the whole town to hear. I forgive you for your weakness. I forgive you for your betrayal." She took a step back, breaking the last invisible chain. "But that does not mean I belong to you. It does not mean I am even yours to be forgiven by. Go, just go." She turned her back on him and walked to Jonah, taking his good hand in hers. They returned to the courtroom, muddy, soaked, and victorious. The judge, his face like thunder, slammed his gavel. In light of the evidence of conspiracy and outright fraud, and in light of the disgraceful criminal activities at the creek bed, this court finds the foreclosure action against the Callahan property and the subsequent sale of water rights by Mr. Callahan to be null and void. He looked at Ruth, then at Maya, and a flicker of deep respect crossed his features. Furthermore, based on the certified copy of the map dated 1853, this court recognizes the doctrine of prior appropriation. The water rights to the spring and creek known as Willow Draw belong to this ranch, senior to any and all other claims. Case dismissed. The courtroom, for the second time, erupted. But it was not a murmur. It was a roar of approval. The townspeople, who had once whispered about her, now crowded around, clapping Jonah on the back, shaking Ruth's hand. They stood together, their hands tightly clasped, as the sound of justice, loud and clear, and finally, unequivocally theirs, washed over them. The aftermath of the trial was quieter than the storm that had preceded it. The town of Dry Chapel, having witnessed the raw drama of justice and deceit, seemed to take a long, collective breath. The whispers that had followed Ruth like a shadow were replaced by nods of profound and quiet respect. When she and Jonah rode in for supplies, the men tipped their hats. The women, who had once looked at her with pity or scorn, now met her eyes with a look of shared understanding, a recognition of strength they had not seen before. The change was not just in glances and greetings. It was made official. A week after the verdict, the county council, the same 5 men who had told Ruth to go home, rode out to Willow Draw. They did not come with legal papers. They came with their hats in their hands. They sat at the heavy table in the small cabin, drinking Ruth's strong coffee, their presence an awkward admission of their past error. "Ma'am," the council head said, his voice humbled, "we are forming a new water board to manage the rights for the whole valley. Fairly this time. We want to ensure the railroad, and men like Pike can never hold us hostage again." He cleared his throat. "We would be honored if you would be the first member. Your knowledge and your courage would be a great service." Ruth looked at Jonah, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod, his eyes full of a quiet pride. She looked at the councilmen, these architects of the old, closed world, now asking her to help them build a new one. A warmth spread through her chest, a feeling of belonging that had nothing to do with a man's name or a piece of paper. It was a belonging she had earned with her own 2 hands. "I will serve," she said simply. The healing of the community was echoed by a deeper, more private healing at the ranch. One cool, clear morning, Jonah took her to the place, the far eastern pasture, where the old, rusted barbed wire fence still marked the line of his long and bitter grief. He did not speak for a long time. He just stood there, looking at the spot where his son had fallen. "For 17 years, he said at last, his voice rough, "I have looked at this wire and seen only hate. I hated the man who put it up. I hated the law that protected him. And I hated myself for not being able to do anything but hate." He had brought with him a single flat stone he had pulled from the creek bed, with his one good hand. He had spent the evenings carefully carving 2 words into it, Ethan Hale. Beneath the name, he had carved the image of a single, soaring hawk. He knelt, his movement stiff, and set the stone at the base of a fence post. It was not a grave marker. It was a landmark, a place of memory, not of anger. "He taught me about stubbornness," Jonah said, looking at the stone, "but I think I learned the wrong lesson. He was stubborn for freedom. I was just stubborn in my pain." He stood up and looked at Ruth. His eyes were clear of the old ghosts. He had finally, after all these years, made a separate peace. He had reconciled with his past, not by forgetting it, but by finally choosing what to remember. The last ghost of Ruth's own past appeared a few days later. Ephraim came alone this time, on a rented horse. He was no longer wearing his fine suit. He was dressed in worn work clothes, and he looked smaller, diminished. He did not come to the cabin. He waited for her by the corral, his hat in his hands. "I am leaving," he said. "Heading west, California, maybe. There is nothing for me here." Ruth simply nodded. He reached into his pocket. "The singer." She took all the money Pike had given me, left me with nothing but this. He held out a small, plain gold band. "Your ring, our wedding ring. I kept it. I thought, maybe." Ruth looked at the ring, the simple circle that had defined her entire adult life. It held no power over her anymore. It was just an object. She gently took it from his calloused, trembling hand. "Thank you, Ephraim," she said, and her voice was not unkind. She held it for a moment. Then she opened her hand and gave it back to him. "This is yours," she said. "It belongs to your life, to your choices. It was never really mine." He looked at her, his face a mask of confusion. "I do not understand." "For 40 years," she explained, her voice patient, as if explaining a complex stitch. "I thought my life was a partnership, but it was not. I was an employee, a good and loyal one, but an employee nonetheless. I did not love myself, Ephraim. I only loved the idea of being a wife. I have learned something, out here in this desert. I have learned that you must love yourself first. You must know your own value before you can truly share it with anyone else." She looked at him, a man she had once known better than her own soul, and she felt a profound and final peace. "I wish you well," she said, and then she turned and walked back toward the cabin, leaving him to his past, as she had finally claimed her future. The changes in Dry Chapel continued to ripple outward. Maya Redbird, her legal victory having made her a local hero, did something revolutionary. She cleared a space in the back of her apothecary and started a class. Twice a week, the women of the town gathered. Most of them were widows, or the wives of men who believed a woman's place was far from any legal document. Maya, using her correspondence course books, began to teach them. They learned to read contracts. They learned about land rights, water laws, and the proper way to file a deed. Ruth attended the first class. She did not come to learn the law. She came to lend her support. She brought one of her quilts, the Lone Star pattern, and spread it on the floor for the women to sit on. "My whole life," she told the small, rapt group, "my voice was in my hands. I spoke with a needle and thread. A good, strong seam was my argument. A warm quilt was my opinion. Your voices can be different. They can be on paper. They can be in the law. A needle can save a man from the cold. But knowing your rights can save your children from poverty. Learn these words. They are the strongest thread you will ever have." Life at Willow Draw settled into a new rhythm, the rhythm of healing and growth. The ugly, blackened scar on the hillside began to show faint traces of green. The new irrigation ditch, dug with their own hands, was a glittering silver ribbon carrying life to the parched fields. The windmill, their tall monument to hope, turned with a steady, gentle creak in the afternoon breeze. Its blades a constant prayer answered with every turn. The cattle, secure and well-watered, grew fat and content. And along the banks of the repaired sluice, the wildflowers returned. A riot of orange and purple, as if the desert itself were grateful for their care. The quiet, comfortable humor that had blossomed between them became a part of their daily language. One evening, Jonah sat watching her read one of Maya's law books by the firelight, his one good hand slowly sanding a new axe handle. He sat in silence for a full hour. Finally, he spoke. "I am still a man of few words," he said, as if it were a new and surprising discovery. Ruth did not look up from her book. A small smile touched her lips. "That is all right," she said. "I have learned to hear the silence." The days fell into a comfortable pattern. The sound of Jonah's hammer was a steady heartbeat. The distant, gentle clang of the church bell on Sunday mornings was a reminder of the community they had helped to heal. The smell of baking cornbread filled the small cabin in the evenings. It was a life of peace, a life they had fought for and won. The world had stopped shouting at them, and they could finally breathe. One night, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge in the vast, velvet sky, Jonah cleared his throat. It was a nervous, uncharacteristic sound. "Ruth," he said, turning to her. His face was earnest in the dim light. "The windmill is built. The water is safe. You could go anywhere you wanted now." Ruth looked out at the dark silhouette of the mountains. She thought of her old life, the gray poplin dress, the endless, thankless mending. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, the broken axle, the fire, the snow. Jonah took a breath. "I was wondering if you would stay for good." Ruth turned to him, her face soft in the starlight. A slow, knowing smile spread across her lips. "Jonah Hale," she said, her voice a low, warm tease. "I have been staying since the day you promised to water what I believe in." They were married in the spring, when the cottonwood trees leafed out in a green so bright and new it hurt the eyes. The ceremony was not in the church. It was held on the bank of the creek, the same creek that had been the source of their conflict and, ultimately, their salvation. The water ran clear and steady over the stones, its quiet, chuckling sound the only music. Reverend Amos officiated, his voice no longer weak with caution but full of a gentle, resonant joy. The entire town, it seemed, had come. The women from Maya's class, the ranchers who had signed the petition, even the men from the county council stood in a loose, respectful circle. Deputy Tully was there, his badge polished, standing as a witness not just to the Union, but to the hard-won peace. Ruth did not wear white. She wore a simple dress the color of the desert sage, made of fine, soft wool she had woven and stitched herself. It was not the dress of a young bride, but of a woman who knew the value of her own hands. In her hair, she had tucked a single, vibrant orange globe mallow blossom. Jonah wore his best clean shirt. His broken arm, now healed, was strong again. He did not wear a suit, but pinned to his collar was a sprig of wild columbine, its delicate spurs a quiet reminder of a long-ago afternoon on a windswept hill. He had carved their wedding rings himself, two thin, perfectly smooth bands of dark, polished cedar wood. They smelled faintly of the forest. Their vows were not flowery. They were promises rooted in the hard earth they stood upon. He promised to be her shelter in the storm. She promised to be his well in the drought. He promised to listen to her wisdom. She promised to honor his silence when the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife. Jonah Hale, the quiet, solitary rancher, leaned in and kissed his bride, and the town of Dry Chapel broke into a spontaneous, heartfelt applause that echoed off the bluffs. A few seasons later, Ruth stood before the women's law class in the back of Maya's apothecary. The room was warm, smelling of dried herbs and ink and the earnest pursuit of knowledge. She had brought her log cabin quilt and spread it on the floor, and the women sat around her, their faces attentive. They had asked her to tell her story, the real story, from the beginning. She spoke of the note on the kitchen table, of the whispers in the church, of the day the law had erased her. She spoke of the broken axle and the dust storm. She told them about the fire and the snow. As she finished, a young woman, newly widowed and facing a greedy brother-in-law, looked at her with tears in her eyes. "But how did you survive it?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "To be so abandoned." Ruth looked at the faces around her, at these women who were learning to forge their own armor from words and statutes. She smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "There is a headline they printed about me. She said it was meant to be cruel, but I have come to see the truth in it. It said, 'Abandoned after 40 years of marriage.' And that was true. I was, but the second part of the story, the part I had to live to understand, is this. The quiet rancher showed her love was still meant to bloom. She looked out the window, toward the distant, hazy shape of the mountains. A late bloom, she said softly, turning back to the women, is still a bloom. It is just as beautiful. Sometimes, it is even stronger for having waited. The themes of their struggle had taken root in the valley and begun to grow. Justice, they had all learned, did not arrive like a thunderclap. It came slowly, quietly, watered by persistence and the courage of ordinary people who refused to be broken. Love, Ruth had come to understand, was not a passive state of being. It was an active choice, a daily act of mending and building and tending to the ground you shared. And age. Age was not a locked door. It was a long, wide porch with a view of the sunset, a place from which you could see the whole landscape of your life, and finally, truly, understand its shape. The circles of conflict had closed, not in victory and defeat, but in a new, more thoughtful balance. Nature, which had assailed them with drought and fire and snow, was now treated with a deep and abiding respect. The new water board, with Ruth as its firmest voice, ensured that the creeks and springs were shared, that the needs of the land were considered alongside the needs of the men. Society, which had once nearly crushed her with its judgment, had bent toward a new kind of fairness, and technology, the barbed wire and dynamite that had been used as weapons of conquest, had been answered with a different kind of progress. The deep well, the repaired sluice, and the tall, elegant windmill were not tools of extortion. They were tools of coexistence. The symbols of their new life were woven into the fabric of their days. The patchwork quilt, pieced together from the scraps of old lives, often lay across their laps in the cool evenings. A testament to a family forged from broken things. And the windmill, its blades turning with a steady, hypnotic rhythm, was a constant, gentle reminder that time, which can take so much, is also generous to those who know how to care for what they have been given. Their life was quiet, but it was full. It was a life of purpose, lived at a humane and deliberate pace. The sharp edges of their solitude had been worn smooth by companionship. One evening, Jonah was grumbling at the stove as he stirred a pot for their supper. He tasted it, his face a mask of deep concentration. "Less beans," he muttered to himself. It was the solemn verdict of a man who had made a profound culinary decision. Ruth, sitting at the table and mending one of his shirts, looked up, her eyes twinkling, but not less love. She said, he looked over at her, and the rare, slow smile that was hers alone spread across his face. "No," he said, "not less love." The final scene of their story was painted in the deep, warm colors of the setting sun. The sky to the west was a blaze of orange and red, the light catching the turning blades of the windmill and making them flash like heliographs. The clean, clear water of the creek glittered as it flowed over the stones, its sound a constant, peaceful murmur. They sat together on the top step of the porch, the same porch Ruth had stood on when her world had ended. Now, it was the foundation of a new one. They did not speak. There was nothing that needed to be said. He reached out his weathered, calloused hand, and she laid her own, equally weathered and strong, into his. His thumb gently stroked her knuckles. It was a small, quiet gesture that held the weight of everything they had survived, and everything they had built. They sat in the luminous twilight, two old, resilient souls, their hands touching, their silence a shared and perfect peace. Thank you for listening to our story tonight. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to my channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.